So, I want to begin our series today talking all about work and why work matters by sharing with you my first experience at work. It actually began when I was 9 years old because I was sitting in a living room with my mom, my dad, my older brother, and my dad randomly said this statement. He said, "What if we open up a kettle corn business?" And thus began the journey of me and my family having a kettle corn business for my entire childhood from that point on. They actually went out and bought a small festival-style kettle corn business that we went and set up at different, events and festivals, and it grew to a point where it ended up becoming one day multiple trailers that we would take to various different events, and we did South by Southwest and Pecan Street Festival and Red Poppy, these huge events. And to this day, I don't know a lot about child labor laws. But I just want to say at this point, I don't want to know. What's done is done. When we began this, I would start off just by bagging the popcorn and doing transactions. I always wanted to do the more manlier job, which my brother and my dad did, which was cook the kettle corn. It was a little bit of an arduous process. It was easy to burn it if you weren't careful. And you had to be tall enough to flip the cast iron kettle over to drop the popcorn in the catch tray. And this might surprise you, but I was not always this tall. And so it was a little bit of a journey for me to learn how to do that. But eventually I started cooking the popcorn. And we'd be at, for example, Pecan Street Festival downtown on 6th Street. There are hundreds of thousands of people that go through that festival every year. And it would be 100 degrees in September. I'm standing next to this kettle, and we're just cooking nonstop for 12 plus hours straight. And this was when we didn't have the automatic stir. And so what we had to do was we had this wooden oar, and we would just have to stir it the entire time. And if you stop stirring, it's going to burn, and that line of customers is going to get really mad at you, and they're all going to know that you did it, and they're going to be staring at you while you messed it all up. And so you just have to keep stirring for your life, essentially. And you also had to wear long sleeve shirts and jeans and a cowboy hat because it's boiling oil and sugar, and so it would pop all over the place. And so if you weren't covered up, your skin would get burned. It still ended up happening regardless of what you were wearing, that it would sneak under a hat or something like that. And it was just this nonstop, grueling grind for hours and hours. I look back on it now, and while I didn't think it was very fun at the time, and I don't really like kettle corn today very much either, I look back on it with immense gratitude, actually, because I just learned so much by doing that business. I had to text my dad and actually just say, "Thank you for starting this business. It taught me so much." It taught me how to drive a trailer. When I was 16, my parents said, "Okay, now you're ready to drive and go set up." And so they would actually pay me extra to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday when I was 16 years old and take the big truck and trailer, drive it down to 6th Street and park it and set up the tent, which to some people on 6th Street at 4 a.m. on Saturday, it is still Friday night. So I saw a lot in my time doing that, I just want to say. But also it was hilarious because every time I would show up driving this truck and this trailer, the event coordinator's eyes would get so big because it looked like a 12-year-old was showing up to set this thing up because I didn't have any facial hair and I was really short. And so, but I learned how to drive a trailer. I learned how to do those kind of things. I learned the value of making sure you make the popcorn right. And when you don't, you remake it because the customer is valuable and we want to give them the best product possible. I learned just what it means to work hard by having to do that weekend after weekend. I just learned what it means to work hard. And so while I didn't think it was very good at the time, I feel like now I look at it and I realize that did something very good in me that I'm grateful for. I'm sure that you have your first job experiences. We could probably all share what our first job was, and we could be here for hours sharing funny stories. The reality is, for all of us, work began at some point for you, or it's going to begin at some point for you. And we spend a lot of time working in our life. There was a study done that looked at broke down how we use various hours throughout our life. It equated the average lifespan to around 72 years old. So if you're over 72, then congratulations, you have broken the study. But 72 years old is about 600,000 hours. And throughout our life, we do a lot of different things. Over a third of that time is spent sleeping, which is either good news for you if you like to sleep or bad news if you don't feel productive when you sleep. Sleeping. And then we have all these other things in no particular order. Eating. Screen time is a pretty sobering one, 73,000 hours with TV and social media. That's a message in and of itself for another time, but that's pretty interesting. Exercising, school, laughing. Another one I found is interesting. Sex, 2,800 hours. There's your random fact of the day. You just take that home and do what you want with it. We also spend about 2,200 hours getting ready. Now, this is an average, I found. For men, it's about 1,100 hours. For ladies, it's about 3,300 hours, which for me, I just found to be so affirming when I read that, because that's my experience. But the good news is, we spend 42,000 hours with family and friends, which we all want to know, right? That's the important part of our life. And then we have this category of other, which is 96,000 hours. It's just everything else, going to the grocery store, running errands, all that kind of stuff. Can you guess how many hours we spend at work in our life? It was on the title screen. I'll give you a hint. It is 90,000 hours, which is only rivaled by other in screen time, and also means it is more than twice the amount of time we spend with our family and friends throughout our life. Depending on what you do for a living and how you feel about what you do for a living, this probably lands in a lot of different areas, right? There's a question I want to pose for all of us in light of this information. How is your 90,000 hours going? How is your 90,000 hours, your job, your work going for you? For some of us in here, 90,000 is an encouraging number because we love what we do. For others, maybe it's just neutral. You just work to provide. You work to survive. It's that whole, you don't work to live, you live to work, or I might have said it backwards there, but it's neutral for you, right? It's like, whatever, okay. And then for some of us, this is a depressing number because for you, work is like a penalty box between the weekends. It's just that thing you do 9 to 5, you check the box so you can kind of check out on the weekends. It's like that 80s song, which see if you can fill in the blank. First Service didn't do a great job. Everybody's working for the weekend. It was like, I think too, I heard a different song actually. I don't know where that came from. That was interesting. We'll have to follow up on that one. Everybody's working for the weekend. When you look up work satisfaction, it's actually really difficult to pinpoint because satisfaction is such a broad term. And in a post-COVID world, the vocational landscape is just changing so rapidly. But there was a recent study done in 2023 from a Pew Research group, and they said this: about 51% of us are satisfied with our job, which is just a little over half, so it's not terrible, but also just barely over half of us. And when you couple that with the fact that work ranks among the lowest in the list of enjoyable activities we do in our life, it causes us to wonder a little bit about work, right? I realize there are exceptions to this. Some of you love your jobs, you enjoy what you do. But it's half of us that are satisfied, and even the half that are satisfied, it's potentially the thing we enjoy doing least in our life, coupled with the fact that we do it for 90,000 hours, should cause all of us to pause and wonder about the role that work plays in our life, right? What's interesting is this past week, or about a week and a half ago, I was working at Red Horn. I go to work at this coffee shop, Red Horn, a lot. We kind of call it our second office here at Northpoint. And the reason is because we all share offices, 2 to 3 per office. And so in order to get stuff done sometimes, you have to leave the office and go elsewhere to do that. And for me, my work, I get to work here as the content director, and I've been on staff full-time for about 8 years now. And my work, because I'm either writing content, developing content, working on projects, editing videos, means I need deep, focused work hours for really mentally focused hours, work for hours at a time. And so I go to coffee shops, and a week and a half ago, I was actually working on this message that we're talking through today. And I've got my noise-canceling earphones on. I'm kind of just typing away. And these 2 people come up to me, and they said, hey, can we share this space with you? Because it was really busy, which I was like, okay, sure, no problem. I've got my noise-canceling earphones in, totally fine. And they start talking, and I didn't mean to eavesdrop, I promise. But what happened was I couldn't help but notice the direction of their conversation started to end up landing in struggles with work. And at some point, I might have paused my music and turned off noise canceling on my earphones, I will be honest. Because this woman started talking about work, and she said this statement, and I wrote it down right then and there. I'm just going to own it. It was pretty creepy, but I wrote it down, what she said, because it was so relatable. She said, I know I need to provide for me, be comfortable, to take care of my kid, but when it comes to work, I have to be able to sustain my soul and be a part of something bigger than myself. I found it to be so interesting that she said that right when I was working on this, right? And we actually got to talking. She saw what I was working on, and I scrolled up really fast so she didn't see that I wrote down what she said. But she saw what I was working on, and we got to talking, and she's talking about work, and I invited her to come. And so if you are here, I just want to publicly apologize for sharing this with all of these people, but hopefully you get something helpful out of it. I think she said something that's so relatable to so many of us. It maybe points to the fact why we have struggles when it comes to work satisfaction and what we enjoy in our life. Because I think for many of us, maybe we bump into this question, or maybe we've never voiced it, but we've felt it or thought it before. Does my work matter? Does my work matter? We all want to live lives of meaning and purpose. And so, of course, we want to invest our 90,000 hours in something that actually makes a difference, in something that matters. We want to drive in, we want to clock in, we want to open the laptop, we want to teach and manage and lead and create. We want to be stay-at-home parents, for those of you who do that. We want to do all of this in such a way that it actually matters in the world, because if it doesn't matter, the fact that we do it for 90,000 hours is just a little depressing. Of course, we want to experience more purpose. We tend to approach work as a means for one of these things, I think, providing, and that's really important. We should be responsible for the people who depend on us. And for some of us in here, if we're just trying to make ends meet, that's a respectable place to be. But we often view work as a means to provide and survive. We view it as a means for success, for identity, or for wealth, for building our wealth or our status in the world. And I'm not necessarily saying that all those things are bad. But what if there is more to work? What if there is a greater purpose to the 90,000 hours we spend working in our life? I think we would all want to know. What's interesting is so often we approach church and Jesus and faith as if it's this thing that happens on Sunday, and then we view our job over here as totally separate. It's this thing that happens Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, right? But God actually speaks into our 90,000 hours in such a way that brings so much purpose to what we do. There's this leader I've followed for a long time. His name is Jeff Henderson, and he was an ex-Chick-fil-A marketing executive. He was a pastor, an author now. Now he's a business and leadership coach, and when he coaches people, he uses this sentence. Well, I just find it so powerful in light of this topic. He says, "You'll never find purpose at work until you discover the purpose of work." You'll never find purpose at until you discover the purpose of. And so as we begin this conversation today, we're not just going to look at the what or the how that we do. We're going to get there later on in the series, but today we're going to zoom out and just foundationally explore why we do it and why it matters. To do this, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, because humans have been working, we've been providing and surviving since we've existed, right? We're going to go all the way back to the beginning in the book of Genesis. Before we get there, I just have to caveat with this, because I recognize for some of us in here, Genesis is maybe something we have questions about. Maybe you have questions about creation, or you're not sure. Is it poetic? Is it literal? How can we know for sure? Those are all really important discussions, really valid questions that we don't have time to hit on today, because we're going to look at what it has to say about work. But there's just two things I would say in light of those questions. For me, I didn't grow up in church, and so I had a lot of questions. And what began to change the way I view Genesis and make me begin to allow it to inform the way I approach the world was not anything it said. It wasn't me checking my brain at the door or just kind of checking out. It was actually just learning more about Jesus, discovering that if he is who he claimed to be and that he did everything that he said, it validates everything that he talked about. Jesus took Genesis seriously, and that's why as a Jesus follower, that's why we take Genesis seriously as well. And if you're not a Jesus follower, I still think there's validity in looking at Genesis, because historians have looked at it as just a philosophical or psychological document that informs so much of our culture and society today, and just speaks to life in a way that's experientially just relevant. And the more you read it, you're like, oh, I've wrestled with those things in some manner. And so I still think there's something of value here today, regardless of what you believe or think about Genesis. Work has been around as a foundation since the onset of humanity. In Genesis 1, it says this. It says, "So God created human beings in his own image." We're going to come back to that phrase in just a second. And I just got to say, if you have questions about the idea of being created in God's image, we just did an entire message about that a few weeks ago in the series, Who Am I? So go back and check that out. But he created human beings in his own image. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." So from the very beginning, God provides this blessing, that we are not just to wander aimlessly in the world, that this blessing actually is in and of itself purpose. It is purpose. It continues. It says he blessed them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. That word govern can be synonymous with other translations say rule over or subdue, reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. So here is the first invitation and calling to work. That we are not just to survive and provide, but it is really a blessing in the form of an invitation to participate with God in adding to, maintaining, cultivating, being a part of this incredible world that we call home. Which means, for those of you in here who perhaps don't make a paycheck for what you do, or you make a little paycheck, I just want to say that your work is no less significant in the way you are participating in the world that God has created. Our team was talking about it this week, and we came across one of those studies that I just think they're so affirming for people related to stay-at-home parents. And it said on salary.com, a stay-at-home parent should earn upwards of $162,581 per year based on what is required of the work. And so if you are a stay-at-home parent, I hope that is so affirming to you. This is why for me, my wife Ashley stays at home with our kids. And for us, when I get home, this has been a learned behavior for me. But when I get home and she says, "How was your day at work, honey?" I usually try to make an effort to say, "How was your day at work, honey?" Because I recognize she is working incredibly hard. And so just because you don't make a paycheck or it's less of a paycheck, it doesn't make it any less significant. You are still participating in what God has called us to do, this thing called work. It continues on in Genesis. Then God looked over all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. Here's where it's important that we are made in God's image. Because we are made to reflect the very character and nature of God, because God worked and created and then invites us to participate in it, and then he calls this whole thing good, it shows us that work is good. The original intent behind work is that it is a good thing, a blessing in the form of an invitation to participate and contribute to the good in the world that we all experience. But I think there's a challenge for us in this because we live in a culture and society that has kind of a gravitational pull towards what is easy and comfortable. And so what we can tend to do is we unintentionally approach life and we assume that something that is hard can't be good, right? Maybe we wouldn't say it this way, but I think this is just kind of the gravitational pull of our culture is to avoid hard things because those are not good things for us. But if we follow that line of thinking, it breaks down quite a bit because I would say some of the best things in life are also some of the most difficult things. My wife, Ashley, and I, we have 2 kids, 2 years old and 7 months old. All that means for us is we are very tired all the time. If you're a parent of littles right now, you understand, and I feel you. I get where you're at. But we're very tired all the time. And the other day, we were, I just got to share this too. We have a letterboard in our house that kind of captures this season of our life because Ashley put this together last week. It says survivin'. Like the vibe of our house is that we are surviving. And so, I don't know, maybe I'm hoping that catches on and becomes a trend, surviving. So you guys take it and use it if you want. Just make sure you hashtag us, whatever that means. We were talking the other day in the car, and we were just automatically talking about when it's time for us to have a third kid. And we had to take a step back and go, we are crazy. Like, we're exhausted. Why would we do that, right? But for us, we just have dreams for our family. We have dreams for the kind of family we want to grow and what we want to do and the good we want to do in the world through our family. And so for us, it's a no-brainer that, yes, it's incredibly difficult and we're exhausted, but of course, we want to continue to grow our family because for us, being a parent is just one of the best things in the world. And if you're a parent, I think you would agree with that. It is so hard, but it is so good, right? I think we do this in relationships. We all know relationships are hard, marriage is hard, but there are moments where it is so good. And I believe the same is true of work, that just because it is hard doesn't mean it can't be good. And so often, sometimes in our culture, in our gravitational pull, we will avoid hardness at work, but I think what we unintentionally do is we throw out the goodness of work with it. And so, of course, we lose a sense of purpose in what we do. You can look at so many secular studies, research, books that all talk about the significance of work, how it's good mentally, emotionally. Tim Keller writes this book called Every Good Endeavor. He's a pastor. He died this past year. He was a pastor in Manhattan, and he pastored a church with all of this, secular people coming in, asking questions about God and church and faith. And here's what he says in his book, Every Good Endeavor, about work. You cannot have a meaningful life without work, but you cannot say that your work is the meaning of your life. It is not the entirety of purpose, but it is a significant part of living a good and purposeful life through the way in which we contribute good to the world through our jobs. Which you might be thinking to yourself, Jeremy, that sounds really nice, doesn't it? But when it comes to what I actually do day to day, all that stuff about participating with God and work being good, okay, fine, whatever. But when it comes down to what I actually do day to day, come on. That's a little bit idealistic, isn't it? And if that's you, that's where you're sitting, that's your pushback, that's what you're thinking, I just want to say you are 100% right. It is ideal, absolutely ideal, because it is a part of the ideal picture of the world that God created when he created work. When you continue to read the narrative of Genesis, you find something that is far more affirming in the tension and struggle and difficulty that we experience day to day in our vocational life. It continues, it describes the fall of man, which is essentially, God creates Adam and Eve, and he puts them in the Garden of Eden to tend to it. He says, hey, don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what do? They eat from it, and it makes them morally aware of what it looks like to live outside of God's design. It brings sin into the world. It brings brokenness into the world. And then God looks at Adam, and he says this, and this so affirms the difficulty we experience with work. To the man he said, since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree whose fruit I commanded you not to eat, the ground is cursed because of you. All your life you will struggle to scratch a living from it. It'll grow thorns and thistles for you, though you will eat of its grains. By the sweat of your brow you will have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you were made. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. This is why I say, regardless of your religious background, I think Genesis is just experientially true, because this speaks to just the difficulty day to day that we experience with work. It speaks to this tension that we feel, where we go, okay, it sounds nice that, we kind of live between these two things of the ideal of work is that it's good, it's a gift, it's a blessing. But the reality is, we all know and experience, is there's this curse associated with it. And this isn't that work is cursed, the conditions surrounding work are cursed. It's why we have this difficulty, this toil associated with it. So what are we to do in that tension? If we are to experience work that matters and invest our $90,000 in something that matters, what are we to do in the midst of that? See, everybody has had access to the goodness of work, but lived within this tension. And so I want to fast forward a few thousand years to what I believe is one of the most defining statements on work in the scriptures. It's said by a guy named Paul. He was a tent maker, a spiritual leader. He wrote half of the New Testament. And in his letter, Colossians, he speaks into how we can know our work matters in light of this tension that we all feel and experience. Paul says this, whatever you do, whether you are a business owner, entrepreneur, teacher, doctor, whatever field you're in, whatever industry, whatever you do, he says, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. It is not just your boss or the company or that client that you work for. You are to treat your job as if you are working for God. Why in the world would we do that? He continues, because since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ you are serving. What is Paul saying here exactly, and what does it mean for us? See, the entire letter of Colossians is written to a broad group of people in all sorts of different vocational backgrounds, but this specific scripture, he also wrote specifically to slaves. There were a lot of slaves in the Roman Empire, and sometimes in certain areas there were more slaves in that population than there were citizens, and their lives really depended upon who their master was. They were property without regulation, so what they experienced in their life was dependent upon just what their master thought about life and thought about them. And so when Paul says these words, whatever you do, he is addressing them to, yes, a broad audience, but specifically also addressing them to a group of people who are potentially working in unthinkable conditions with zero rights, zero benefits, and potentially for the worst bosses imaginable. And he says, give it your all. Give it your all. Why? Because you are actually serving somebody far greater. It is not just your earthly boss, your earthly master you are serving. You are actually accountable to someone far greater in heaven. That's why Paul says there's this inheritance. That's why we know this is written to slaves. It would have been crazy to say that to a slave because they were property. They didn't receive an inheritance. But he's saying your inheritance is going to come. It is a reward on the other side of this life for serving and working diligently and faithfully throughout your life because you view your work as a platform for the God that you ultimately represent. Paul is not minimizing any work conditions or work circumstances. What he's saying is we are to not fall to the standards of our work circumstances, but rise to the dignity of who we ultimately work for. There's this word vocation that we're all familiar with, right? And we use it interchangeably between jobs and work and things like that. The original Latin use of the word is actually this, is vocare, which means to call, which means when it comes to our vocation, a job is only a vocation if we are called to do it, and we are called by somebody else, and we do it for them rather than ourselves. When you become a follower of Jesus, it is not just a faith decision. It is something that encompasses every aspect of your life. It gives meaning and purpose to every aspect of your life, and it also gives meaning and purpose to what you do for your 90,000 hours. That you can know your work matters because of who you work for, who you represent, who you are ultimately accountable to is the thing that determines why your work matters. Not just what or how you do it, but the why is driven by the who. I realize for a conversation like this lands in so many different places. I mean, so many different jobs are represented in this room, watching online. I mean, some people could have just been laid off and they're in here hearing this conversation. It lands in so many different places. There are so many whatabouts and what ifs and pushbacks, and I get that. We're going to get to some of those later on in the series as we get a lot more practical. Today is building this foundation of viewing work through the lens of who we ultimately work for. But there are a few byproducts of this that I want to spend the rest of our time talking about. When Paul says whatever you do, there's an implication to that. And there's something that we experience just the longer we live, the longer we work. And I think we'd all agree, if we're honest, that we all know there is no perfect job. There is no perfect job. I think so often we are searching for some sort of perfect job scenario that's going to fulfill every aspect of us. For me and my job, again, I'm content director here at Northpoint, been doing it for 8 years. And for me and my job, there are two things that I've heard on the other side of people consistently for those 8 years. One of them is just, Jordan talked about it, our associate pastor talked about it a few weeks ago, is that whenever I meet somebody new, I will try to avoid the topic of what I do for a living for as long as possible. The reason I do that is because you're talking and hanging out with a neighbor or something like that, and instantly when they say, "What do you do for work?" and I say I work for a church, it just gets weird. It just does. They start talking differently. They start treating you differently. They're backtracking and thinking, "Oh my gosh, what did I say?" They start cussing less. Like it's really hysterical to watch. But I've experienced this so much. 6 months ago, I kid you not, I was grabbing a beer with a neighbor. We were sitting at this bar, and this guy is next to us, and he starts talking to us, and we're sharing this whole conversation, and he starts talking about churches and his views on churches and religion and churches and money, and then people who work for churches. And then he stops talking at some point, and he turns to the rest of us and says, "So what do you do for a living?" And I'm not ashamed of what I do. I love what I do. It just gets weird with people. And so I so badly just wanted to be like, I work for a nonprofit. I do content that we do on Sundays with large groups of people, primarily centered around Jesus. That's what I do for a living. I so badly wanted to say that. I didn't. I mean, it turned into a really interesting conversation from there. We'll leave that for another time. But the other thing that I experience more significantly, and I hear this from people a lot, is, we'll talk about what I do for a living, and then they'll say, "Man, it must be so nice to experience so much meaning and purpose at work." And I just got to be honest. I would say, yes, it is awesome. It's one of the things I love most about my job is I get to sit on the other side of marriages that have been healed, eternities that have been changed forever. I mean, I love this part of my job. At the same time, as I've heard this over the years, what I have just observed is that we all tend to make a lot of assumptions about each other's jobs. We just make a lot of assumptions about what one of us does for a living, right? Like we don't fully know, but we just assume. And I made assumptions going into this job. I got into it for the meaning and purpose that it provides, which is absolutely amazing. But there was a lot of things I didn't know about work, and I didn't know about this job at the time too. I didn't know how interconnected faith, family, community, friends, finances, marriage, everything would become working for a church. Because it's just not, you just can't leave work at work. It just comes home with you when you work for a church. There's a couple reasons why. It's just churches and people are messy, and this messiness just gets all over your life when you work for a church. This is why, sometimes I find myself asking questions of just, golly, this is so complex. And I just wonder, this person left, and they were really close to me, and now I don't even see them anymore, and it's because of I work at a church. That's just complex. Or I wonder about, none of you guys would like it very much if I got up or Buck or Jordan or Jen, any of us got up and said, man, really struggling in our marriage and our finances and our personal faith and all, there's an accountability to sitting up here and doing this. We're professional Christians, per se. We have to hold it together. Our lives have to be morally sound to sit up here and talk to you guys and talk about life. So there's a complexity that comes with that. And for some of you in here, you do shift work, or maybe your coworkers are like family to you, and so you get aspects of this, right? The other thing I didn't know was going to happen was that there was just going to be this Sunday drumbeat. We have a phrase that we say here behind the scenes, our team, we say, Sunday is always coming. Sunday is always coming. We say that because it's this deadline that's always on the horizon to produce something for large groups of people every single week on a weekly basis, 50 times a year. And there's just a lot of working pieces that go into making this happen. And so no matter what happens in your personal life or in the personal life of somebody in the church or somebody else on the staff, no matter what's going on financially, maritally, whatever it is, Sunday's coming. And so if it gets to Thursday, because we work Sunday through Thursday, most of us on staff do, if it gets to Thursday and that sermon is not written fully yet, or that video is not edited, that project isn't completed, well then sorry family, sorry weekend plans, Sunday's coming. And you get this. This is not unique to me. You have end of quarter, you have deadlines, you have launch dates, you have projects, right? We all experience those things. My point with sharing all of that is not to say, woe is me, not to say, oh, look, my job is hard. We all experience complexities at work, and I love what I do. I'm so grateful for it, who I get to do it with, this mission and vision as a church. I love that I get to be part of this. But I've just observed that we all tend to assume when it comes to work, the grass is always greener on the other side. If I could just get that job, that thing, that perfect scenario, I would maybe be fulfilled. It's interesting because as I've gotten this question over the years, my response in my mind has been, man, sometimes I wish I didn't have a job with a lot of this meaning and purpose. Sometimes it'd be nice just to, not have Sunday always coming. Sometimes it'd be nice to not have my personal life and work always interconnected. And it's the same thing that somebody else is going, man, it'd be nice to have a job with more meaning and purpose. The grass is always greener on the other side, isn't it? But the reality is for all of us, there is no perfect job. And let us not assume that an external change in our work life, granted, sometimes we need to do that. Sometimes there's a better opportunity or there's a change that need to be made. But let us not assume that even that change is going to fix something internally warped in our perception of work. It's not just about the what or the how. More important is why and who we do it for. And with that understanding comes something really meaningful because we understand there is no job without purpose. There's no job without purpose. When you view it through the lens of who you work for, it gives meaning and purpose to everything you do. It impacts what you do. It's not just people who work at churches and nonprofits that are in full-time ministry, right? Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. Go to the ends of the earth. Take up your cross daily. Follow me. He said all these statements. And what he didn't say was, oh, this only applies to people who work at churches and nonprofits. I want you guys to listen up really quick. If you are a Jesus follower, you consider yourself to be a Jesus follower, you are in full-time ministry. If you are a Jesus follower, you are in full-time ministry because the way you show up to work every single day is a platform and representative of the God that you ultimately serve and are accountable to. But this does not mean that we get weird with our work and we start passive-aggressively playing Christian music in our office or praying out loud at lunch really loud. That's not what this means, okay? Sometimes those things are fine, but I think they make more of a point than a difference most of the time. This means we are just to show up every day to our job and work with excellence and diligence and steward the responsibilities we've been given in such a way that brings glory to our Heavenly Father and ultimately serves as a testament to Jesus. I love how Martin Luther says it. He says it far better than I can. He says this quote, "The Christian shoemaker does his Christian duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship." I think the world needs more entrepreneurs and business owners and teachers and doctors and leaders who show up and work with that kind of mindset. It's not just churches and nonprofit people. If you are a Jesus follower, you are in full-time ministry because of the God that you ultimately represent. If you're not a Jesus follower, I think this is why you should become one. Because Jesus doesn't just answer the existential questions, he gives meaning and purpose to every single part of our life, including our 90,000 hours. And so again, lands in a lot of different places. I have questions, pushbacks, what if, what about, right? Those are all valid. This is just foundational. I'm going to prove foundational for the rest of our time, for the rest of our series. But I want you to just imagine for a moment. Today, we get to the end of that big game that is going to happen that we're not supposed to say because we're streaming on YouTube and we could get flagged for it. The big game that's happening, right? And man, Kelsey wins and T Swift, she just storms the field to the soundtrack of Love Story. It's amazing, right? Imagine all that happening. And then you turn off the TV and you clean up the dishes and your friends leave. What if you weren't filled with dread that Monday was coming? What if you weren't filled with dread? What if you were filled with a sense of purpose that tomorrow is Monday? It's going to require you to view the lens, to change the lens within which you view work to who you ultimately work for. But I believe it can be something that revolutionizes how you experience your 90,000 hours. Throughout this series, we're going to get far more practical. We're going to talk about work-life balance, struggles at work. What do we do when we feel stuck at work? What does it mean to be great at work? How do we align our giftings with our job? We're going to talk about all of these things. You're not just hearing from the teaching team in this series. You're going to hear real stories from people in this church and business leaders in this community who just show up to work in this profound way and have amazing insights into work as well. I'm really excited for where we're going. But the challenge today is this, is to view your job through the lens of who you work for. And so today, as you walk out, you're going to get handed one of these cards for those of you in person. It just has our bottom line and this Colossians, this foundational verse on it. The challenge that I have for you is I want you to put this somewhere where you're going to see it when you're working, whether it's a laptop, an office, your car, or in your pocket or your wallet, whatever your job is, put it somewhere that you can see it when you're working to remind you to bring all of you wholeheartedly to your job. If you're watching online, we're just going to post these on social media. You can grab them there, put them on your phone background as well. My prayer and hope for all of us is that we can experience something different at work, but ultimately not based on what or how or circumstances, based on who. Your work matters because of who you work for. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you that you are good, and because you are good, you give us good things. You provide us this gift of work. Father, I pray that you would just challenge us to think about work differently, to think about what we're doing differently, to not just see that we're, serving coffee or we're creating software, we're doing all these different things, but ultimately we are serving you. And we just want to invite you into our jobs. God, for those of us who have never done that before, who have kind of thought work is separate from faith, we just invite you into it. Would you allow us to experience something meaningful and full of purpose in our 90,000? And would you meet us right where we are, no matter where we are vocationally? Father, continue to teach us throughout this series what it means to show up at work this way. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys for being here. We'll see you next week for part 2.